Welcome back to week 2 of photo history. This week we're going to be talking about the art versus science debate and putting that into context. Last week we looked at the different processes, and we could see because of the characteristics of those different processes that people started to kind of pigeonhole them as having different uses. One's better for one thing, the other is better for this. So if you recall, the daguerreotype, because of its really stunning detail, was viewed as kind of this scientific recorder of accuracy. Whereas the calotype, because having a paper substrate that this light-sensitive compound was applied to, it gave it a really much softer look. There's not as much detail. So this very early on gets viewed as being the more aesthetic, kind of artistic choice, whereas daguerreotype is just accurate. It's something that you record. They didn't think as much about the role that the camera had in the look of it, and it was just treated as kind of, that's how things look. When we fast forward early on in the kind of mid-1800s, you have Oscar Raylander, who is pursuing photography as an art form. He was one of the pioneers of something that we call combination printing, where he would think of this as photo collage, but this is before Photoshop. This is way, way before Photoshop. So he's photographed different elements and has come up with a way to composite them all together. Think of this as an analog composite. This is, no Photoshop here. And combine them all into one scene. Another example. This British photographer, Henry Peach Robinson, Raylander and Robinson knew each other and worked together for a while. Robinson also practiced a combination printing kind of approach, where he's assembling the image from several other negatives. So this is a famous one. His most famous, this one called Fading Away, came out in 1858. You can see there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's at least 6 different elements that he's composited together here. You can think of this as an early attempt at trying to make images that are not merely of something. So, for instance, think of Talbot's picture of a broom standing against an open door. These are pictures that are trying to be about something. Another practitioner of what would eventually become known as Pictorialism, Julia Margaret Cameron. This is one of her images. A lot of the so-called pictorialists like to photograph things from legends and myths. So this one is called The Passing of King Arthur. So she made a lot of photographs like this of scenes out of mythology. Some more examples of that. When you look at her work, right away it makes me think, it calls to mind the Czech artist Alphonse Mucha. This is one of his paintings from his series called The Slav Epic, about his attempt to deal with the mythology of Slavic history. But he's mostly known for his commercial work, these posters for this brand of champagne that is still around to this day. Later pictorialism, you had folks like Edward Steichen. Steichen was trained as a painter. Many of the pictorialists were, so it was natural that they wanted to use this tool to make images with a similar aesthetic to the way that they were trained to paint. There's another example of Steichen's. These are photographs, but they have a beautiful atmospheric feel to them. That was very important to a lot of these photographers. Think back to our lecture last week of Turner and his atmospheric use of light and color. I would say that these photographers are very much in that same stream, that same way of thinking. Really quickly, because we have a lot of other things I'd like to cover, some characteristics of pictorialism. They employ the conscious use of manipulation, the artisan physical interventions, as opposed to merely recording a scene. As we saw in some of the George Eastman House videos, a lot of the processes that the pictorialists used required handwork or some brushwork, things where they had to get their hands into it. Often they were soft focus, so the lenses that they used, they would shoot with the lenses at the widest aperture they could so that they would have very shallow depth of field, and they would get really, really soft when photographed that way. Often they would tone their prints. This is one of those things, any of you who have some darkroom experience maybe have seen this. It's something we can still do today with our darkroom prints, but there's ways you can tone the prints in different chemicals to get warmer tones or cooler tones. So just because we think of them as being black and white because color photography hadn't been invented yet, they're still able to tone these and get different color casts into their black and white images. There's a very strong emphasis on emotions. So as we discussed last week, this fits very well with that trend of romanticism and later transcendentalism in American literature and other art forms. So this is of a piece with that. There's often a narrative component involved. So as I mentioned, myth and legend that they're referring to. And again, images that are trying to be about something, not merely of something. So as we proceed to examine how photography struggled with the idea of being an art form, whether it should be, and if so, how, often we approach this assuming that we understand what art is and how it works. But usually that's not the case, or maybe we have a very incomplete understanding. So we're going to take a step back, we're going to look at some art theory, and then we're going to have some case studies that we'll apply this to. So back when I was an undergrad studying philosophy, one of my professors, Leon Rosenstein over at San Diego State, I had 2 semesters with him, and we debated this. Every person that we read, we talked about their theory for what made something art, and we had lots of great debates about it. What Professor Rosenstein proposed was, instead of it being this black and white, that is art or that is not kind of debate, which people still do today, they'll get into really fierce debates about whether or not something can be considered art. Professor Rosenstein proposed this sliding scale. So on one end of the scale, you have things that have a definite function. The materials are very important. So think of a coffee mug. It has a function. The materials are very important. If the coffee mug that we make doesn't hold the coffee, then it's kind of a failure as a coffee mug. There tends not to be a message, concept, or idea, although you might have, something printed like world's best dad or something like that. But they tend to be, it's a cup. It holds your coffee, and there's no great concept behind it. So we tend to think of that as being craft. It's pretty easy to get our heads around that one. At the other end of the spectrum, we have something that's all about the ideas. There's definitely an idea, message, there's a concept here. The materials are of secondary importance at best. So there might be materials, but they're really not that important to it. Maybe they're kind of a necessary evil to get the thing made, but they're not nearly as important as the materials are in a craft object. So we might term something at this end of the spectrum as philosophy. Maybe it's propaganda. So I think with something at this end of the spectrum, the message is so important, the other things are just kind of taken for granted. In the middle, this is where art lives. So if we're going to consider it to be art, it's got to have a mixture of, it has materials. Maybe there's somewhat of a function, but there's materials and there's some kind of an idea or concept. And the materials and the concept need each other to work out the idea or the feeling that's trying to be communicated. One of the things that I appreciate about this sliding scale is that it allows room for debate. It's not so black and white as this is art or it is not art. We can debate this. One of the examples we considered in the class that I took with Professor Rosenstein was the book The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. It's a classic piece of Russian literature from the late 1800s. If you haven't read it or if you're not familiar with it, definitely check it out. Also know going into it that it's a bit of work, especially coming from our day and age, but it's well worth it. To me, that book is art because of the creative way that it uses the materials, which is language, grammar, sounds, with the ideas that it's considering. There's really big, heavy questions in there about theology and philosophy and human nature that I think is really fascinating. And that's not the kind of thing that you see in literature anymore. Professor Rosenstein disagreed. He said in his mind that it's pure philosophy. It's not art because it's so much about these questions that Dostoevsky was wrestling with. So we agreed to disagree. But the great thing about this sliding scale is that disagree though we might, it's pretty clear that you would have to place Brothers Karamazov somewhere maybe between the center, where we would say art is roughly, somewhere between there and the right where philosophy and propaganda and ideas and all that are. So somewhere in between there is where something like that lives. The really beautiful framed posters that you can buy at IKEA of these abstract patterns. To me, I think they're definitely not pure craft, but I would say they're somewhere between craft and art, somewhere over there, because there isn't necessarily an idea or message or concept behind them. There's definitely some creative use of materials, but it gets harder to distinguish them from, let's say, maybe just the rug that you put on the floor that might have a cool pattern and some nice colors, but you probably aren't thinking of it as art, or you might not be walking on it and sitting on it and spilling things on it. So you can see this sliding scale is pretty helpful. We don't have to place something into these hard categories that they either fit in or they don't. We recognize that there's a little bit of room for debate here. We recognize that there is some subjectivity in here, and it's hard to escape that. We'll stop here for now. In the next video, we'll consider the role of art criticism. So what does it mean to critique a piece of work, and how do you critique a piece of artwork? So we'll get into that in quite a bit more detail, and we'll have some examples for that. But I thought this would be a good place to start, is just give ourselves a framework for how to understand whether or not something is art.